attitudes in government, in the intellectual culture, the media, much of scholarship, and so on. It traces back to the earliest foreign policy efforts of the newly founded republic, the infant empire, as George Washington called it. The most famous document is the Monroe Doctrine in the 1820s, which said, essentially, keep out, this is our little region over here. Well, that couldn't be implemented at the time. There was a deterrent. It wasn't the Russians, it was the British. The British fleet was just too powerful, and the British Army was. That's why Canada is not technically a colony of the United States, though it's more and more becoming one in practice. But several efforts to invade Canada were beaten back by British force. And the U.S. also couldn't conquer Cuba as it wanted to do in the 1820s because the British fleet was in the way. And in general, the Monroe Doctrine couldn't be implemented. But it was understood by the deeper thinkers that that was a temporary affair. John Quincy Adams, who's considered the great grand strategist of early American foreign policy, and in fact probably the author, certainly the intellectual author of Manifest Destiny and the Monroe Doctrine, he explained in the 1820s that, yes, we can't conquer Cuba now, the British are in the way, but if we wait, Cuba will sooner or later fall into our hands by the laws of political gravitation, the way an apple falls from a tree, meaning we're going to get stronger and stronger, the British are going to get weaker and weaker, and pretty soon we'll be able to conquer Cuba. Well, that in fact happened in 1898. Theodore Roosevelt, who was incidentally an incredible charlatan, put on his uniform, made sure the photographs were taken properly, and led the famous effort of the Rough Riders to help what was called liberating Cuba. In fact, what it meant was preventing Cuba from liberating itself from Spain, as it was just about to do, and turning it into a virtual colony, as it remained until 1959, and it has been under constant, unremitting terror and economic warfare ever since, for pretty good reasons. This is the first foreign policy goal of the infant empire, and for it to move towards independence is pretty shocking. In fact, we know why the attack on Cuba is so savage, and to realize how savage it is, you really have to look at the details. I mean, it began with extensive terror, straight terror, under Kennedy and Johnson, and went on. But particularly savage and striking is the economic warfare. I mean, huge resources go into ensuring, to tracking every ship in the world, to make sure that it doesn't stop somewhere and pick up some steel that might have Cuban nickel in it. And if it does, it's going to have to be barred from U.S. ports. Much more effort goes into this than to, say, tracking terrorist finances and sort of minor things like that. It's really an obsession. And the reasons are explained in the internal documents. That it's a very free country, so we have a lot of internal records. You go back to the Kennedy-Johnson years, the explanation was that all of this is necessary at that time, significant terror activities, because of Cuba's successful defiance of policies going back 150 years, meaning to the Monroe Doctrine. No Russians, that's to scare the domestic population. It's successful defiance of the Monroe Doctrine, which established that this little region over here is for us to run, and independent countries are not tolerated. The Cuba case is an interesting one in the study of American foreign policy. I mean, for decades, the American population, the U.S. population, has been in favor of normalization of relations with Cuba by large margins. But it's normal for the population to be disregarded. That's called democracy. But what's less normal is that American business is in favor of it. Now, typically, foreign policy is almost a reflex of business interests. But in this case, major sectors of American industry, agribusiness, pharmaceuticals, energy corporations, big guys, are in favor of normalizing relations. But the state is overruling them. And that is unusual. And I think that reflects one of the few really meaningful, significant principles of international affairs. Most of it is kind of at the level of Wilsonian idealism, but there are some real principles. And one of the major principles, I think, ought to be called the mafia doctrine. International affairs are very much like the mafia. The godfather does not tolerate disobedience. It's too dangerous. It doesn't matter how tiny it is. It can be some small storekeeper somewhere who isn't paying his protection money. That can't be tolerated because, to borrow Kissinger's terms, the virus can spread contagion elsewhere. Others may get the same idea. So it's not enough to send your goons in to get the money, because the Don really doesn't need it. You have to beat them to a pulp and make it clear to everyone else that this kind of behavior is not tolerated. Maybe in the realms of magic realism, but not in the real world. Here we have to make sure that there's discipline, and successful defiance cannot be tolerated. It's a bad message. Actually, Arthur Schlesinger, well-known liberal historian who was Kennedy's one of his chief Latin American advisors, he explained it when he presented to the incoming president, President Kennedy, the report of a Latin American mission that Kennedy had established to sort of lay out policies for the hemisphere. And he pointed out that Cuba is a real problem. And the problem, he said, is the spread of the Castro idea of taking matters into your own hands, which might influence other countries in Latin America where people are suffering from the same kind of repression and violence. And once you allow that, then the virus might spread contagion and the whole system of domination might erode. And that's what you hear consistently in internal policy planning from liberals like Schlesinger and Kennedy to whatever you call Henry Kissinger. I'm not sure. I don't want to use the word that comes to mind, so you make up your word. But right across the spectrum. And it's a very rational policy, which is why it is never abandoned. To the public, it's called the domino theory. If Vietnam falls, Ho Chi Minh will conquer California, and so on and so forth. That's what you present to the public. And of course, when these things never happen, you say, well, it was a mistake, it didn't understand, and so on. But the authentic domino theory is never retracted, because it's right. It is perfectly true that if you allow successful defiance somewhere, others might get the same idea and try to take matters into their own hands, and pretty soon the system of domination erodes and collapses. Actually, that's what's beginning to happen now in South America, and it's very worrisome to U.S. planners. That's why you have the kinds of actions I briefly mentioned before. All of this is pretty straight in the internal record. As I said, we're lucky to be in a very free country where we can really get access to what internal planning is. We're also, from another point of view, lucky to be in a very disciplined country, so nobody ever hears about it. But it's there if you want to do the work. For the National Security Council, highest planning body, back in the early 50s, laid out the primary threat to U.S. interests in Latin America. It said the primary interest is posed by radical and nationalistic regimes that appeal to the masses of the population and seek to satisfy the popular demand for immediate improvement in the low living standards of the masses and development for domestic needs. And these tendencies conflict with the demand for a political and economic climate conducive to private investment with adequate repatriation of profits and protection of our raw materials. The last phrase is George Kennan, who explained that it's just kind of like an accident that the raw materials happen to be somewhere else. They're really ours. We got to protect them. And in fact, a large part of subsequent history follows from these conceptions, which are completely unchallenged and make perfect sense. You know, if you're the Godfather, those are exactly the right principles, so they're not challenged. That's Zelaya's problem. He was starting to stray from orthodoxy. He was beginning to offer a very mild challenge to these fundamental principles. The New York Times, using terminology that is rare for them, so I give them credit, reported that the coup reflected a class division, rare term in U.S. Discourse. It reflected a yawning political and economic divide. For the small upper class, Zelaya was becoming a threat to what they called democracy, meaning the rule of the most powerful business and political forces in the country. Okay, that's successful defiance. And he was really going pretty far. For example, he raised the minimum wage a little bit, a miserable minimal wage in a country where 60% of the population live in poverty. But if you're an observant Don, you notice things like that, and it's dangerous. You start with raising the minimum wage, pretty soon you lose control of the world. If we can't control Latin America, we can't control the world.